Good day. I'd like to talk about a number of things today. It's just a general posting that I have. The first thing I'd like to talk about is, of course, the cycle that we're seeing today, the Islamization of Britain and the colonization of Malaysia and the colonization of Britain, and how all these various historical things are connected. They're actually connected. If you are a historian of pattern, you will realize that history works in a particular pattern. And if you don't learn history, you will have the tendency to repeat certain patterns, and it's happening ever more so today. And no matter how much you want to talk about against it or for it, genuinely human beings, unless they are really enlightened and really mindful about the things that are going on in their life, would hardly be able to stop thinking about it that way. Let me give you an example. Earlier on, I was just listening to a talk on the Bhagavad Gita, and it was talking about a blindness that Arjuna has at the end of the Bhagavad Gita. In the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, there was a blindness that a king had, and that the king was physically blind, obviously, and had to ask his warriors to tell him what was happening in the battlefield. That's a physical blindness. That's the kind of blindness where your eyes can't see the things that are happening around you. It's a physical deformity, and for those who have it, definitely, they have blessings of other things. I remember I took a trip to Singapore one time, and I went to the NTU, Nanyang Technological University, and there was this exhibition called Dialogue in the Dark. Now, as black as my hair, the inside of that exhibition was dark, complete darkness. And where is darkness, the blind can see. So our guides were all people who were blind. The blind tends to have a stigma in the world. We tend to see them as people who can't make it across the street and all that. And I don't want to think of the blind people that way, because since that time, when I was in the Dialogue in the Dark, I depended on a blind person to get around. She asked us to touch, I had to find out where my friend was. I had to touch him. How many hands was there between me and my friend? And then we had to use the stick and listen for the sound and think about the space. While at the same time, it was just pitch black. We couldn't see anything. And we could imagine ourselves getting onto boat key. And most importantly, we imagined ourselves sitting down, not just imagining this time, but actually drinking a cup of tea, where we look at the clock, anti-clockwise or clockwise. 3 o'clock, your cup's at 3 o'clock. And this is hot water with hot tea. And we're serving tea and drinking the tea in the dark. Okay, and of course I had some money to give her in the dark as well. I made sure that was the correct money that I had, Otherwise I might have given her too much money or too little money. But anyway, coming back to physical blindness being something that Bhagavad Gita was talking about in the beginning, it was also talking about a certain blindness at the end, and this is what we call mindful blindness. Even when we're most mindful, we can be blind at the most specific things that are blinding. For me, maybe I'm blind about the foods that cause weight gain. Okay, I might be blind about that, which is why I gain so much weight. However, if I undergo a certain routine where I'm more mindful of the food that I eat, then eventually I'll gain some insight and sight on certain foods. But I go back to a time when I was very mindful about a lot of things in my life, to the point where I was dopamine fasting, and I thought that mindfulness would extend to a lot of places in my life, except it didn't extend to one particular place, and that was publication. At that time, I was publishing my book, Stories from Another Universe, by SBPRA. And I had no idea, that's the book over there, yeah? At the very same time, there were other publishers who were in court cases with the said publishing house, because they were not very happy with the arrangements that were made with Vanity Publishing. They weren't getting what they wanted, and they weren't touring about places. I don't know what was the thing. But here I was, publishing my book with theirs, yet at the same time, at the very same time as that was happening on the news or somewhere to the back end, and I only found out about this later on when I researched about the company, that they were facing those battles. Precisely in 2017, when I was mindful of the food I ate, mindful of the exercises I did, mindful of all the things. You know, a lot of bad habits were dropped. I was mindful of a lot of things except for the publication of this book and where it would be published. I think it would have been better to have been published in some other fashion or with an agent or something like that, but I don't know. Nevertheless, it's published where it's published, and that's it. And there's not much I can do about it. But it goes to show that, and I was doing daily meditations. I did more daily meditations then than I'm doing today. And yet, I wasn't able to figure out the mindfulness that we were talking about in the Bhagavad Gita. This blindness was something I had insofar as certain subjects were concerned. And it's not our fault that we feel that way. It isn't. If we're blind in a mindful way, it's not really our fault. It's just the way we're built and the way we see things and what we're supporting at the present moment. Now, why am I saying all of this? Because I wanted to talk about what's going on in the world today and the reactions toward it. I wouldn't want to explain what my political position is. Those who know me will know my political position, will know who I choose and all that. But if Britain is facing Islamization and there is a caliphate coming in, it's possibly something that the British people are not mindful about. They're not mindful about the fact that over the years, moral decay, cultural vacuum, leaving Christianity, for instance, not understanding their own heritage, the new atheism, and the rise of the woke culture, and the rise of the left, steered us into this mess. If there is no opening, they can't come in. We've seen horror movies where the priest says, if there's no opening, put a circle of salt around the house, and if there's no opening, the bad spirit cannot come in. All right? I think you've seen such things before. And in various religions, they say, unless you invite them in, then they can come in. And the same thing with vampires and vampire movies. Unless you invite them in, unless they're already in, then there's nothing much you can do about it. And in some way, I think British people have been inviting them in without realizing the consequence. If they were able to get, let's say, migrants from Jamaica, from India and Pakistan, and even Malaysia and Arabia, who were able to contribute to the economy. That's a key word. If you can't contribute to the economy, if you don't accept British culture for what it is, off you go. You're not allowed in the UK. I know it sounds very harsh, but we're talking about the UK here. We're talking about Britain. Britain has Celtic culture, English culture as its basis. And that's been the case for 1,400 years. What happened before that, of course, is something I'm going to talk about a little bit as a deep dive today in history. Now, why I'm so laissez-faire about all of this is because we colonized them and now they're here. The same can be said for Christianity, can't it? Let's go back to the year 476 AD. Alaric the Goth had just sacked Rome Rome was a city, the eternal city, situated on the central plains of Italy, on the west coast, along the Tiber River, right, not far from the Tyrrhenian Sea. And Rome, as an Etruscan settlement, later developed into a small power that later developed into a regional power that contested lands against Celts. At one point in time, the Celts wanted to sack Rome because it was vulnerable to be done so. And if you watch a documentary about the Celts versus the Romans, you will see that. But in the years that were leaning closer to the time of Jesus, about 2050 to 2060 years ago, Rome won against Vercingetorix in Gaul and thus conquered what is today known as modern France and named it as Gaul after the Gallic people that lived there, the Celts that lived there. And from then onwards, moved up to the island of Britannia, which they call Britannia. In those days, Britannia consisted not of English people, but of modern Welsh tribes that were known as the Brittonic people. You had the Iceni, you had the Reged, you had the various other tribes, Danoni and so forth. And all these various tribes were given Latin names, of course, because they were in contact with Latin culture. One particular tribe, the Iceni of East Anglia, had a queen called Boadicea. And in London today, the statue of Queen Boadicea is in such an iconic place in front of the Mall to show the might of the British culture. But if you look at Boadicea, she's actually a queen of tragedy. Her daughters, and possibly herself, were raped by Roman centurions, and in so doing, had to face annexation of their lands to the Romans after, I think, her husband died. I'm not so sure about the story. But what I see there is that there's this vulnerable land that has been taken over by these group of people, the Romans, who for hundreds of years thereafter, about 400 years thereafter, were colonized by the Romans. At the same time, the Romans had conquered Judea and Israel. Israel. They conquered Judea and Israel, which are the two kingdoms left from the time of King David. Samaria being the capital of Israel, and Judea, capital in Jerusalem. Jerusalem being the capital of Judea. When General Pompey entered Jerusalem and entered the Holy of Holies, he expected to see a grand statue similar to that of Zeus or Poseidon, glaring at him. Instead, he saw a room that was empty, except for some lit candles and incense. Similar to if the king of Saudi Arabia would enter the Kaaba today. You would see a room just of columns and incense and scents, and it would be a clean room, or they would have to clean it up, but it shows that there is nothing there to worship, which means that this God that the Jews, and of course with the Kaaba the Muslims, worship is a God that cannot be seen, touched, or figured out. So, of course, General Pompey, coming from the polytheistic culture, would wonder, what is all this about? He was so disgusted to the point where he felt like pulling the place down. But wait a minute. It would happen in 70 CE that the whole temple was pulled down during a Jewish upheaval. And they renamed the whole temple as Capitolinus and placed a statue of Jupiter where the Holy of Holies were. Today, only a wall remains of that area, which the Jews consider a sacred place, which is why they call it the Wailing Wall. And above there, of course, is the Al-Aqsa, which the Muslims had placed during Islamic rule, and is in the exact same location as the Holy of Holies of ancient times. Nevertheless, what I'm trying to say here is that Rome conquered Judea, and in doing so, and Jesus living during the time of colonialism there, is a bit like the British colonizing India. So the Indians are in Britain because the Brits were in India. The Jews are in Rome because the Romans were in Judea. Okay, there's that logic. And it's not so far off, because many Europeans were already taking in a Jewish culture, and they were known as God believers. They were not accepted as Jews 100% because possibly some of them did not participate in Mosaic law, but they were that interested in changing their lives to understand the Bible a lot more, that there's a Greek version of the Old Testament produced in Alexandria in Egypt, hundreds of years before, a couple of years before Christ, and it's called the Septuagint. The Septuagint was there before Christianity. So if you think about the fact that the Gospels were written in Greek, yes, they were, but you also had the Septuagint, which was the Hebrew Bible, written in Greek before that, because you had God lovers or God followers or people, Greek people who were a lot more interested in Jewish culture. And at the same time, you also had Hellenistic Jews who were interested in Greek culture. A lot of them were used to collect taxes from the Jews. They said that St. Matthew used to be a tax collector, and that's the reason why he was much hated by the other apostles before he gave it up for Jesus, of course. And you have all these different notions or different people, because this is what happens when two different cultures come together, is that they borrow off each other, okay? The Hellenists give the idea of physical beauty, stadium, Olympics, sports, money, materialism, commerce. And the Jews give the God awareness, monotheism, morality, a lot of things that we consider as conservative culture comes from the Abrahamic religions, and that's what the Jews provided as a basis. So you had Greeks that were following that, and you had Jews that were following Greeks. So this is the interplay of cultures, and what I'm trying to mention here is that if you want to look at why Britain is becoming a caliphate, slowly, it is because of that precise exchange that I'm trying to talk about in the ancient world as well. How you got Jewish Eastern culture. In fact, Christianity itself is a product of Asia. It has come from Asia and was brought into Europe with a Romanization, except the only difference is that it's been so long that the West has been Christian, to the point that it really does believe that Christianity equals Western culture. But the origins of Christianity, Jesus Christ was a Jew. All right, Jesus Christ was a Jew from Palestine, from Israel, and as a Jew from there, obviously that is in the Levant and what today we call West Asia. In fact, in those days, Asia was only Asia Minor, which is Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. So you had Asia Minor in the north, and you had a Levant. So it wasn't considered as the Asian continent we know to today. So the extent of Asian culture, or it being starkly Asian, did not really happen to the Europeans through Christianity, because it came from a world that was familiar to Europe. And that world was brought to familiarity through the Roman Empire. This is a result of Roman Empire. And then you can look at the story of St. Patrick in Ireland, how he came from the Old North, which the Welsh called the Old North, because in those days, when it was under Roman rule, southern Scotland, the southern lowlands, was actually part of the Welsh kingdoms. There was Reged, there was Strathclyde, and even the River Clyde itself is actually a very Welsh name. It's not Scottish. So where modern-day Glasgow is, used to be Welsh country. And in fact, if you ask the Welsh poets, there's even there's even a poetry about the Old North, referring to southern Scotland in Welsh poetry. And that the heroes in that poetry are placed somewhere there. And it could be that Patrick, as a patrician, was a Christian of the Old North. Now, the Old North is considered a very interesting area. It's quite fluctuating, the southern lowlands of Scotland, where my mum comes from, Glasgow area, because it's placed between two Roman walls. When Britain initially faced Romanization, you had a couple of commanders like Agricola, Septimius Severus, and of course the Emperor Hadrian. Now, each of these conquerors laid a certain mark on southern part of Scotland or the northern part of their reach. Beyond that, they called it Caledonia. So that's Roman for the highlands of Scotland, okay? But anywhere that's within would be part of Roman Britannia. There was no England back then because the English tribes hadn't come yet. So, and the Welsh were not called the Welsh because they were not outcasts yet. In fact, the word Welsh, welas, means outcasts. And there's a group of outcasts in Switzerland that are called Welsh by the German Swiss. They use the word velas, which is German for outcast, similar to welas, which is Anglo-Saxon for outcast. And there are French people in Judea are the Welsh, whereas the Welsh in Britain, of course, are the Brythonic Celts. So, near Patrick from there was kidnapped by pirates, brought to Hibernia. The Romans called Ireland Hibernia because it was a land of winter. It's called Ireland, which is Emerald Isle, named after how green it is, Emerald Isle, Erin. And of course there, St. Patrick was, had to undergo slavery and stuff like that, and eventually escaped. And he went back to Scotland, or went back to Britain at the time. Okay, now, he went back to a Britain that was about to change. The Britain he left was a Britain that had Roman Christianity, but the Britain that he went back to was a Britain that was being pillaged by Anglo-Saxons who were coming about and recreating a medieval-style England, an England that was not Christian. So Christianity first came with the Romans, but it fell when the English people came. Where did English people come from? They came from the Danish peninsula, from western Denmark and Jutland, known as the Jutes, down to the Angelen River area in Schleswig-Holstein, as well as down to Saxony, Saxon-Anhalt, around Hamburg and Hanover area, and of course the Frisians from the Frisian Islands off the coast of Netherlands in northern Holland. All of these groups that came from this region moved across the North Sea seeking for work, helping with the infrastructure of Roman Britain that was falling and decaying. There's a story that says that King Vortigern was unable to pay the fee of Hengist and Horsa, and as a result of that, there was a rebellion that happened, and there was genocide, and the Welsh were shoved into the west of the island where they were called outcasts, welas, and Anglo-Saxon England, they renamed Roman Britannia as Engleland, and there were 7 different kingdoms in Engleland, from the Kingdom of East Anglia to the Kingdom of Wessex, the Kingdom of Kent, the Kingdom of Mercia, and the Kingdom of Northumbria, until you have the time of Alfred, and then under Aethelstan, all the kings unite against the Vikings. Watch the Netflix Last Kingdom to know more about all of that, yeah? I don't know which extent is it good, but you get a notion, historical notion anyway. And I'm speaking notionally, I'm only speaking with whatever knowledge I have. Now coming back to Patrick, and he came back to Ireland, and he Christianized Ireland using the clover to explain the Trinity. And, of course, after that, he Christianized Ireland in his own way, that Ireland became a monastic civilization. And Irish Christianity, or Celtic Christianity, spread from Ireland into Scotland and was based on the Isle of Iona. At the same time, you have Pope Gregory I, who looks at these three young boys. I don't know whether there's a sense of pedophilia here, and they were blonde boys, and one said, "Your Holiness, these are English boys." He said, "Not Anglo, no, these are Angles." He said, "Not Angles, angels, angels." And out of that, he sent St. Augustine to Canterbury, to Kent, to educate the King of Kent, who had married a Frankish princess, Queen Bertha, who was already Christian at that time. So Bertha brought Christianity to Kent, and they established a monastery at Canterbury. So that's why the Anglican Church has their centre in Canterbury. So you've got Christianity from Rome, which is English Christianity slowly developing in England, and you have the Celtic Christianity from Iona and Scotland. So much so that in Northumbria, you had a problem with Easter. According to one of the churches, the end of Lent, which is the beginning of Easter, happened at this date, and the Roman Church had another date. So as a result of that, the royal couple could not be in bed with each other at appropriate times, so they had to choose one particular church. I think it was either the king was following Celtic Christianity and the queen was following Roman Christianity. But eventually they chose Roman Christianity as they were in England, and that settled it. And that was during the Council of Jarrow, I think. So all of this is in Bede's Chronicles of the Anglo-Saxons. Why am I saying all of this? I'm talking about all of this is because it's not a given that Christianity is a Western religion. It is the result of Rome. And if you were a Roman experiencing the rise of Christianity in your city, it's like a British person experiencing the rise of Islam in Europe, in Britain today. The Roman would feel, what happened to the honoring of Jupiter, the Vestal Virgins, looking at the omens, going to see the witch for omen reading. What about the Hides of March? Various other festivals of the Roman calendar. What about homage to Poseidon, for instance, the festival of Poseidon, or Venus? Homage to Venus. What about all these? And you've also got the Parthenon, which is a place where all the different gods used to be in the center of Rome. It has a circle on top of it and a dome. And I remember I visited that place in Rome, and if it rained, it would rain right in the middle of that building as well. It was quite funny. And then it was made into a church, of course. And now I think it's a museum. But what I was trying to say is that with Christianity coming into Rome, I'm sure a lot of them thought that this is another religion, we can't be scantily dressed anymore because there are Christians around. We can't, we can't. The biggest thing that Christians were accused of in the early days was atheism. Now you might find that's really funny. How can Christians be atheists? They were atheists because they were not believers in the Roman gods and goddesses. That's why they were atheists. And in those days, if you wanted to be a Roman citizen, if you wanted to show allegiance to the Roman Empire, you had to observe the holy days of the gods and goddesses. And if you don't observe that, then you are a traitor. Similar to those people who don't honor the flag today in America, or don't honor, or do not, celebrate Merdeka, for instance, here in Malaysia and so forth. You're dishonoring your country. You don't stand to attention when your national anthem is being played at a sports event. It's like as if you're a traitor to your country. Well, that's exactly how Romans felt about Christians. And that's exactly the problem that Christianity brought to Rome prior to the Edict of Milan in 310, when Christianity was then allowed to be practiced without persecution. And that had a lot to do with a character that came from Eboracum, which is a Roman town in the north of England called York. His name known as Constantine. Not only did he free the Christians in Rome, but he founded Christianity he founded a new place in Constantinople. Now, why am I bringing all of this up? Is because if you look at Islam in the West today, again, and I'm going to talk about this in part 2, all right? So I'll get back to you and we'll talk about it in part 2. All right, thank you for listening.